Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hello from Dr. Stevens in Dublin, and we have Dr. Mark Roberts with us today up in Belfast. So today's webinar is regarding the relationship economy, the natural successor to the knowledge economy. So thanks to everyone who's joined online. I'll just give you a little bit about Mark, who's joined us today from Belfast. Mark graduated from the University in Aberdeen in 2000 and did his postgraduate training in a number of different hospitals and then subsequently ended up in Northern Ireland. He then studied a Master's in Public Health before returning to clinical medicine training, and since November 2017, he has been the Clinical Director for the HSC Safety Forum in the North. So he took up a consultant post in acute geriatric medicine in 2011 and also has been a training program director for acute medicine, clinical information officer for Southern Trust, elected to fellowships by the London Royal College of Physicians and completed the Scottish Patients Fellowship program. So he's been very busy. So we're so delighted to have him with us today to do one of our last webinars before we take a break for the summer. So just some housekeeping. So today we want it to be as interactive as possible. So you'll see at the top right-hand corner on the chat box, if you click on that, you can type in any comments or queries or questions for Mark, and we'll have time at the end to deal with those. If you're having trouble with sound, you can listen over the computer, or you can dial in, and we put in the dial-in number into the chat box for you, and it's also there on the screen at the moment. We also will be doing some tweeting throughout the webinar, and if anyone else wants to tweet, or if you're in a room with a group of people, take a photo, tweet at QI Talk Time, let us know how many of you are watching us together. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mark, who's going to take us through his presentation, and then at the end we'll have some time for any questions or comments that have come up throughout the webinar. Thanks a million, Mark.
Thank you very much, Roisin. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great privilege for me to be asked to participate in your webinars. I feel slightly like a fish out of water because I normally like to see whether I'm boring or exciting the audience. So I'm going to rely on Roisin giving me some hand signals as to whether people are falling asleep or getting really fired up about what I've got to say. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm looking to Roisin to give me the sound's working and coming through okay. I know we had a few technical problems initially. Okay, so like I said, it's a great privilege to be presenting today. I slightly provocatively, for some people, have suggested that maybe the relationship economy is the natural successor to the knowledge economy. Let's see how we go over the next half an hour or 40 minutes. I think the first thing I want to do, though, is give you a declaration, because I think we all look at life from our own particular lens. So there's that joke about if somebody comes in with chest pain or epigastric pain into a cardiologist, they're much more likely to end up with cardiac type investigations, and if you come in under a gut specialist, a gut gastroenterologist, you're much more likely to end up with a camera test for the same problem. And I think there's some truth to that. We all have our different tools, and we look for confirmation bias in the world around us, in the journals that we read, the articles that we read, to agree with the construct that we've built. So a little bit about my construct so that you can interpret what I'm saying during the course of the next half an hour and use it or discard it. So an acknowledgement, first of all, that we all have cognitive biases. My cognitive biases are very much because I genuinely regard myself as a generalist. I know that's not necessarily a term that is rising in credibility yet, but I hope it will. I see myself in the acute position and a geriatric medicine consultant, and also in my new job, I also have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. So I'm very much into the generalist perspective, and I think what that means is, I'm just getting a wee message there. I think we're getting some technical problems. I don't think that's with me individually, Roisin, is that right? You can hear me okay? I'm getting a few comments through saying that the sound is very muffled. Sorry, folks, I'm just going to pause for a moment and check. Roisin, can you come back online so that I can hear you?
How if I unmuted myself? Yeah, just Mark, if you just, it's just maybe the wire's just causing a little bit of interference.
How's that sound? I can hold it in this position.
Yeah, and talk a little bit slower, I'd say. Just, yeah. Perfect.
Yeah,
Thanks.
no problem. Thank you. So I think we all have our cognitive biases. My cognitive biases because I generally look at the world from a generalist perspective. And what that means is that I tend to go more for width. I feel the need to know a little bit about a lot rather than necessarily going for depth, although there's times, obviously, for individual in my clinical environment, I need to go for more depth. What that does is it colors my perspective, and I think I'm therefore heavily more dependent on a broader team, and therefore would value a team over the team effectiveness or team brilliance more than the individual effectiveness and individual brilliance. So that colors how I view the world. And like I said, I think that's just important for you to know that perspective from the start. So what's on the menu today? Well, I want us to consider the possible limitations of the knowledge economy as I see it. I want us to consider the role that I think relationships play both in promoting effective care, but also inhibiting actively or passively safe and effective care. And I want to touch towards the end on the need to understand more broadly social capital and its value. Most of us in health and social care are familiar with the value of financial capital, and usually questions from the public are about money and beds and bums on seats. But I think we need to be more aware of social capital as a resource. And the diagrams below, that's not my boat, I wish it was, but I want you to consider the next half an hour more like we're on a sailing boat and we're going a little bit with the prevailing winds as they come into my mind, and that the ground isn't necessarily as solid as, for example, the train track on the right, where all of this is grounded in heavy evidence-based knowledge. So it's a combination really of my experience, things that I've read through my cognitive bias lens, and from what I've seen work, and from what I've picked up from people who are leading lights in this area. So first, a little bit about me. So if you're looking at me from one angle, and ask my children, they would say that I'm an annoying dad, and in fact, if I constructed a wordle, annoying would probably come up most frequently. If I was meeting you on the weekend, I would describe myself as an enthusiastic but sadly mediocre windsurfer. And for the perspectives of today, I'm Mark. I'm the clinical director for the Health and Social Care Safety Forum in Northern Ireland, and that's really a small team of about 5 or 6 of us who are the paid nucleus for improvement activity in Northern Ireland, and we are about to grow, potentially double in size. But what we do a lot in our work is about providing collaborative platforms for people across the region in Northern Ireland, and to collaborate, learn from each other, and spread good practice, and try and align those practices as much as possible with the strategic priorities of the Department of Health. And my route up till now, and there's a reason for giving a little bit of this background, is that I had a fairly uneventful undergraduate and then postgraduate period, but about 4 years in, I wanted to leave for public health medicine, partly because I was inspired by some of the leading lights of what I see as the golden age of public health medicine. So some people will recognize the picture of John Snow, who established that a pump on Broad Street in an English city was the source of the cholera epidemic. And the picture on the right is a great example of not only measurement, but displaying measurement effectively. And he identified through the shaded areas where the cholera cases were, and where the possible factor that was contributing to the cholera cases were, and famously removed the pump. And in many ways, the rest is history. People's understanding of cholera, the importance of sanitation, and those sort of things rose up to prominence and led to a lot of the big public health gains of the 18th and 19th century. But I did miss the punters. So I enjoyed the bigger picture view, but I missed the punters, as I would call them, the patients. And you can have a patient with, on paper, the same condition, but everybody comes with a slightly different perspective, a different way of managing their condition, different expectations, a different collection of relatives or next of kin and their expectations. And I actually enjoy that interaction. So I'm very privileged now, because I feel in my safety forum role, I do that half-time, and half-time I see myself as a generalist, and I get a little bit of both. And hopefully that gives me a chip on both shoulders when I'm having a bad day. So let's think about what our big challenges are. And I think this is true for all, certainly developed societies, and I think developing societies as well. I think the first thing that we should acknowledge is that whilst money at times seems like it's increasing it's reasonable to say that all developed countries are really struggling to cope with health and social care budgets, trying to get them under control, very aware of the increasing older population with its increasing care needs. And we're getting a relative decline in health and social care spending forecast over the next 10 to 15 years. I know that in the UK government, Theresa May's just offered a substantial injection, but these are not necessarily long-term sustainable injections of cash. I think the other thing that we have is we are genuinely seeing increasing complexity in individuals. We know that many more people are now living with long-term conditions, and part of that is down to the success of modern healthcare, and in many ways that is to be celebrated. But we also have, coupled with that complexity, increasing complexity in our care systems, and we are all familiar with the silos that often make transformation and working together, working collaboratively much more challenging. And finally, I think we're dealing with an increasing expectation from patients and the public. And I know that there's been difficult cases both north and south of the border relating to this recently, that avoidable harm is perceived to be avoidable. And I know avoidable harm means different things to different people, but in our context, avoidable harm isn't always avoidable. Well, from my perspective, there may be cases where somebody has come to harm under the care of a team that I'm associated with or somebody else is associated with. But it's actually, when you tease that out, it's not always easy to establish where it would have been avoidable when you're dealing with limited information and making time-critical decisions about what to do that's best. So I'm a doctor, but I don't think any of health and social care professional would regard their origins as any different. We put great value in the knowledge economy, and I could have filled 100 slides with different journals from around the world and still only captured a proportion of them worldwide. And I think the fundamental point about the knowledge economy is that we have this cornerstone of it. The anchor point is really that intellectual capital is key. But there's a risk with that, and I acknowledge that we need a subject matter expertise and intellectual capital, but there's a risk that if we put too much weight on that, I think it enables that individual to regard it's about their intellect, their intellectual capabilities, and that enables them to move away from what you could argue is collectivism, working together, collaboration, more towards individualism. And it would encourage an unintended, possibly, move towards thinking more about the I, what I bring, what I know, and my position in that hierarchy, rather than the more collective we, what we know. And I think the other problem that it does, and I think again this is unintended, but it helps propagate the role of the hero leader, the person who knows the answers. And we see that a lot in health and social care across lots of sectors where leaders are projected and expected to know the answers, and we promote and encourage that model, and that encourages people who are earlier in their career to think that is the way I need to behave. And I see this, for example, in my young children when they're watching certain types of animation. The young leader is expected to have the answers. People are looking at them with wonder, waiting for pronouncements. And I think in the age of where we're talking, for example, in the North about collective leadership, I think that's something that we need to constructively challenge. And I know challenge to that is happening, which is a good thing, but it needs to gather much more pace. The problem for me about the knowledge economy is that it leads to some core beliefs that often aren't particularly well articulated. And actually, we had an event not long ago where the Chief Executive, Anne Kilgallen, who's a public health doctor by background, very eloquently and very humbly, in my view, spoke about how her views as a doctor and even as a Chief Executive, she has to sense check herself. The core belief that if she works hard enough and are clever enough, that mistakes won't happen. And I think we can all come into work with some of these core beliefs that we haven't necessarily checked, that we've presumed they're so core, they're so central to our system. And I think that is a byproduct of the knowledge economy and being deeply immersed in it. And I think we can see that, and certainly Anne did, can see that there's danger in that approach, and that in itself is not sufficient. So I hope at this stage I've got most of you still on board agreeing that knowledge in itself is not enough. And I want to switch to another area before I start talking about relationships. And forgive me that I'm using Northern Ireland data, but I think the similarities with your experience will be definitely there. So I apologize that this diagram isn't necessarily projecting as well as we'd like, but effectively that is the Northern Ireland public sector budget for 2016 from official sources. And the big yellow half is the Department of Health, which covers social services as well. And you can see the quarter, which is purple, is the Department of Education, which is self-explanatory, and they get about 2 billion a year. The Department of Health in 2016 got close to 5 billion a year. And then the rest is split up between infrastructure projects, sewage, roads, the Department of Agriculture, Department for Communities, Department for the Economy, Department of Justice. So everything comes under that broad umbrella, but you can see how big a beast health and social care is. And the reason why I'm flagging this up is if you look at the official figures for 2015 and 16, right up to 2017 and 18, you can see that the budget has been creeping slowly and more recently just above 5 billion for the health and social care budget. The thing I want to draw your attention to is the proportion that it's been taking. So over the last 3 years, we've been eating more and more of the Northern Ireland public sector budget for health and social care. And I'm a doctor, and if I speak to nurses or I speak to healthcare managers, they think that's probably a good thing, that we're getting more money. And I understand that when we're looking at it just from our perspective. But if we take the same growth and project it forward to 23, 24, and these are my projections on the current trend, then we're looking at taking 60% of the health and social care budget. Sorry, I just had an interruption there from the phone call, but I'm not on call, so they can call back later. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that 60% is a sizable amount when we've moved in a relatively short period of time from 44%. And why does this matter in a discussion like today? Well, I don't think health and social care is ever, when it has unintended consequences or negative, ever have a small effect. And the effects of a hungry health and social care system can be quite dramatic. And if we look at the other areas that the pie chart was servicing, so I mentioned education, mentioned policing, you could look at play areas, you could look at the Department of Justice, you could look at roads and infrastructure, you could look at sewage. If we take a step back and think back to that golden era of public health where John Snow took off that pump because he realized that sewage and infected water with cholera was a key cause of that population's ill health. If we're not careful, then these areas start to suffer, and we end up having to spend more and more money on the reactive side of health and social care, and we have less and less money on the things, not just the traditional public health things, but the leisure things, the crime, the connectivity, the education, which is such a strong predictor of people's health and well-being and their years free from illness. And we end up very quickly and inadvertently in a rapid spiral where we're chasing our tail. So I hope you're still with me, that knowledge isn't sufficient and that there's severe pressures on our financial system and our financial capital, and that even if we continue at this rate and our growth and start trumping up other areas of the budget, that actually even that isn't enough. So where does relationships fit in amongst all this? I've been to, as many of you I'm sure, have been to presentations from other industries where, frankly, we're compared unfavorably often to the records of safety critical industries like aviation, like oil and gas, like nuclear industry. But I mean, health and social care, whilst I think it should learn from other industries, is fundamentally different in 3 ways to these industries. First of all, it's possible if you're in aviation to press the pause button, not fly the particular plane, stop a particular route, think about decommissioning certain types of planes if there's been an accident. In health and social care, we're often trying to repair the plane whilst it's flying. The other thing that I think we have is that, unlike these industries, their, if you'd like, failures and harms have been very dramatic. So you think of Chernobyl, you think of Piper Alpha in the North Sea with their oil rig, you think of events involving major airline crashes and the events that led up to those. In some ways, it's easier to forensically analyze and work out what was going on in those incidences, and it's also sometimes easier to create a burning platform off the back of a dramatic and large event, rather than the events that we have in health and social care when harm occurs. It can sometimes be unseen, it can sometimes be imperceptible. The signals telling us that harm is occurring can be relatively weak, and we are not necessarily always tuned into them. So I think that creates a real challenge for us. So not only can we not stand down the health and social care system, some of our signals for when harm is occurring are less developed. But I think the third and really important reason why we've got to be cautious about our comparisons is because we're a people business unlike any of those. We're dealing with not only machines, but people operating machines, people receiving care from machines, and everybody, like I alluded to earlier, patients with the same condition can react very differently in terms of their expectations, their self-management, their level of understanding, and that creates a whole new level of complexity for us. I'm not justifying not learning from other industries, but I think we do need to make sure that we put the appropriate caveats in, because I know whilst the enthusiasts like myself would like to learn from other industries, there is a huge swathe of health and social care staff who will very quickly point to those differences, even if they can't always articulate them. So relationships are key in health and social care, and they're key because in many ways we're a little bit mechanized, aren't we? And I know some people lament that, but hospitals, for example, they're like a machine. They're not always that well oiled, but relationships oil that machine. And if we look at some of the different roles in the team that I have in my clinical world, I'm interacting with lots of different people. Obviously the patients, obviously my clinical colleagues on the front line, but the next of kin, occasionally members from the management team, and different team members interacting with each other. And I think it's really vital that these relationships oil the machine, because not only do they help that machine work more effectively, I think they also do something really important in health and social care, which is to humanize the machine and make sure that we're not losing sight of both the individuals and the people working in it and the people who are receiving care from it. I'm not a revolutionary. I see myself as more of somebody who believes in evolution rather than revolution. And some people on Twitter will be following this guy, Jeremy Shrivens. He's based in Australia. He talks a lot about collaboration and work on how industries can prepare themselves for the challenges of the next 20 and 30 years, and maximizing the contribution from employees and moving away from the language of compliance. And I think there's just a lot of truth to this phrase. At the core of hierarchy is the idea that the worker owes their existence to the owner as a paternal father, not fellow. And that's really not the space that we want to be in when we're talking about collaboration. But I do think that we have to accept hierarchies. They're not going to suddenly be overturned, and I'm not necessarily saying that we should overturn them. What I think we should be doing is, whilst a lot of clinical teams have flattened their hierarchies, because there's been good evidence that a steep hierarchy in a clinical team can lead to risks and behaviours that are detrimental to safety, I think we've not been as quick in catching up organisationally with flattening hierarchies. So I don't believe a flat hierarchy is an oxymoron. Obviously, somebody needs to have responsibility, play some sort of leadership role in the social construct, but it is possible to greatly flatten it and make it much more responsive, not only so that top down we get the right information and the right intelligence at the top and at the front line, but also right to left, so that that sort of horizontal lateral movement of ideas and energy is much more likely as we get the system to move us out of our silos. So I think we can flatten the hierarchy organizationally, but I think the other thing we can all do as individuals is think differently about how we interact with each other. And whenever I'm having an interaction, I always try and make sure that the interaction is really based on an adult-to-adult interaction. In a previous existence, for example, if I was a trainee doctor speaking to a senior manager in a hospital, I might have almost taken a more of a parent-child relationship. And that's unhelpful, because if I put myself in the child role, then that's almost forcing the other person into the parent role, and that role is very restrictive. It does not breed collaboration. It's more about the language of compliance, and when the parent sides are gazed off, then the child can do things differently. Whereas I think when we move collectively towards much more of an adult-adult relationship, both as individuals but also between organizations, I think that's where the mutual respect and the understanding, it doesn't mean we all have to agree with each other or necessarily share all of the same values, but I think the basic expectation that we interact as adults working together, trying to improve something is absolutely key if we're going to try and maximize the downsides or minimize the downsides, should I say, of hierarchical systems. So am I just talking about being nicer and enjoying work more? I wouldn't forgive you. I would forgive you for thinking that. I want to maybe illustrate in a clinical story why I think it's much more than that. And for those of you who are familiar with Systems 1 and Systems 2 thinking, it's just a bit of a refresher for people who haven't heard this terminology before, just give you a little bit of insight into what it means. So in broad terms, we tend to think in Systems 1 thinking or in Systems 2 thinking. And if I'm the cyclist on the left, I see the signals, I see the patterns, I can see I'm on a particular type of bike, I can tell by my posture I'm sitting upright and I can see the road and it's telling me just to cycle the way I normally do. I can be more relaxed, I'm alert to possible dangers, but fundamentally everything is happening in a very sort of automatic, fast way. And that's Systems 1 thinking. As you put me onto the bike that this guy's trying to navigate down a mountain, I'll be much more cautious. I'll be much more analytical about the terrain ahead. I'll be thinking about the boulders. I'll be thinking about my weight distribution. I'll be thinking about whether the tires are overinflated, underinflated, possibly thinking about wind and climate. And that's much more analytical. That's Systems 2 thinking. It's slower. And most of us spend our working days, once we get comfortable and reach a certain level of competence, in Systems 1 thinking, which is a lot about pattern recognition. And I want to just illustrate the potential risks of that in a case that is a true case. I've not embellished it. It was involving a severely ill young male a few years ago in an emergency department, in the hospital where I was working. He'd come in by an ambulance as a standby call, extremely wheezy, very unwell. And the team were working on him. We were the team, and he's been proactively treated for asthma in the emergency department as aggressively as we could, to the point that anaesthetic members who were there to potentially put him to sleep and take him out to intensive care were being called. Whilst this was going on, a single team member identified actually in a history, this is a 20-year-old, there was no asthma history. And that more importantly than that, potentially, there was a suggestion of a heart problem, a cardiac problem in the notes that hadn't really been worked up or further and defined in the notes that were available at the time. And the problem was that condition, and for those of you who are interested, it was hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. That condition, in certain cases, can mimic asthma. So usually it would be sudden collapses or certain types of chest pain or reduced exercise tolerance. But on this occasion, it was mimicking asthma. And the problem was, not only were we not making things better, but we were making things worse because of the treatment that we were giving, because our Systems 1 thinking, our automatic response, was spotting the wheeze, spotting a young man, seeing him very ill, thinking the last time I saw this, it was an asthmatic, and they responded well. So we're going to throw the kitchen sink. And you can understand how quickly and easily that can happen. So the team was locked in Systems 1 thinking, and this person was able to step back and think more about Systems 2 thinking. So what happened? Well, the team agreed to switch, and it's quite a dramatic and in many ways a courageous switch. That was agreed by the team, and the improvements duly followed, and stabilization duly followed. And whilst he went to a higher dependency environment, he didn't have to go to the highest dependency environment, and ultimately did well. My question to you to reflect on is whether knowledge, the knowledge of that cardiac condition, was the only thing at play. So I absolutely acknowledge that knowledge was vitally important here. But I would argue that the knowledge economy, if you wanted to phrase it in that way, was not the only thing at play here. And many of you have read Simon Sinek's book, and I like this description of a team. It's not a group of people that work together. It's a team is a group of people that trust each other. And trust is a word that's going to come up again and again. And my argument would be that team that I was part of trusted each other sufficiently that when that point was made, they all collectively agreed to switch tack. Whereas I think if that team dynamic wasn't there and that trust wasn't there, to make such a bold move on, again, limited information might have been seen as too bold, and the person could have had an adverse outcome because we would have been chasing the wrong diagnosis because of our type 1 thinking. And I think if you invest equally in relationships as in knowledge, so not trying to subvert knowledge, but thinking about rebalancing what we're doing, I think a number of things potentially happen. I think you become more patient in building relationships with colleagues, building relationships with patients and clients, and building relationships with other people that you're working with. I think you become more empathetic, and we know that's what patients and clients want. They want us to try and put us in their shoes, to understand their unique context. And to quote William Osler, it's not the type of disease a patient has, but the type of person that has a disease. And I think that strikes to the heart of that. And I think it means that you then reinvest more in connections and trust rather than simply, and I shouldn't say rather than, but as well as intellectual function, so that the two can complement, so that you're really maximizing your chances for good outcomes. I think it helps build a network because that is part of your support structure. People talk a lot about resilience and joy in work. I think this is about reforming teams, reforming connections, having people reconnected to the wider mission statements. And I think this is really important. I think you are more receptive to constructive challenge if you're in relationships where you respect and trust each other more. So if I'm having a very difficult relationship or no relationship with somebody and they come out of the blue and give me a challenge, that may elicit an emotional response from me that is unhelpful, first of all, for the person's care, but also for the way I'm processing or the way I'm interacting or the way I then ask my team to interact. And I think it's really important that we are receptive to constructive challenge, and I think good working relations are really important and undervalued. I was in two minds whether to put a quote up by Leonard Nimoy that most people will know played Spock, because I don't want you thinking that I'm some sort of closet Trekkie. I'm happy for an unannounced visit to my closet to check that I don't have any strange uniforms for Star Trek conventions. But I remember around the time that he died about 3 years ago, there was a few interviews being run in the media, and this particular phrase really struck a chord with me. He said, in response to what do you think made Star Trek so appealing and its popularity so broad and wide, and he said it was a group of professionals who trust each other, who operate in a meritocracy. Very similar echoes to what Simon Sinek was saying. And I think that word trust has appeared there again. And I think trust happens particularly when there's a sense of a meritocracy. As soon as there's a sense of perceived injustice or favoritism where the unit or the organization is split into winners and losers, then you start to rapidly erode that trust. And I think there's truth to the phrase that trust arrives on a tortoise and leaves on a horse. I think if we're going to invest in trust, we need to make sure that we're trustworthy and that we also operate in a meritocracy. Until relatively recently, I would have said that culture is the most important overarching thing. And we see this a lot in documents or in conversations with people struggling to improve care and talk about we need to improve the culture, and that it's a target or it's part of an action plan, and that once we improve culture, things will get better. But actually, there's things that affect culture that I hadn't really thought about as much until Shelley Jeffcott, a human factors specialist based in Scotland, really challenged some of my thinking on this and used this as a description of systems and determining what the culture is like and having a major influence in culture. So that whilst the phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast is often bandied around well, I think there's a less understanding that systems influence and eat culture. The example she used was that, for example, she was asked to do some work in relation to operating theatre environments not far away from each other, where one was perceived to have a very macho culture, where debriefs weren't happening, reflections weren't happening, surgical pauses were maybe not happening the way they should have. And in another unit, those things were happening, and it was very much personalised to the individuals, particularly the surgeons. They were macho, they didn't really buy into that. Actually, when she, as a human factors specialist, went in, she recognised that actually the system in the place where the culture was perceived to be macho and negative did not enable any pauses between surgeries to occur. So it was very much like a machine, like a conveyor belt. There was no time built in to allow the debriefs to facilitate the proper checklist, the correct pauses. And it was actually the system that was helping to generate the culture rather than the other way around. So I'm coming near the end, hopefully not too soon before my time, but I want to ask broader questions. Do our systems at the moment support relationship building? And I think you probably know from my tone that I don't think they do at the moment. First of all, we're siloed organizationally. That's partly by design and partly by accident, but we end up often not talking or knowing of teams that have a direct and indirect influence on our work and vice versa. There is a real lack, certainly in the north and other places where I've worked, for shared spaces, and the currency of space for beds and space for storing enormous amounts of notes or equipment is usually given much more value than the idea of shared spaces where teams can come together, learn together, share together, and laugh together. And I know there's some good examples of where that's not the case, where those shared spaces are being deliberately constructed, and we need to follow that lead to a much greater extent. The other thing is, and I think the IHI recently are coming into this, I forget the term they use, consummation, I think it is. But really, we're talking about simply eating together, teams eating together. And I think I would mirror the analogy with families. So families that eat together have a better understanding of each other's challenges, have a greater connection. And I think teams that eat together likewise. But we've seen an erosion of opportunities for teams to eat together. Lots of people eat their lunch at their desk. We don't really have that relationship building unless people actively do it despite the circumstances rather than because of it. So people are tilted away from these things. And I think also, particularly in hospital, in a health and social care system where the acute sector has such a disproportionate voice, we tend to address the needs of the burning building rather than stepping back and thinking about what good experiences and bad experiences are telling us and teaching us, so that we can reflect, extract the learning, if you want to call it that, extract the knowledge, if you want to call it that, so that you maximize the opportunities for reducing the chances of bad experiences and increasing the chances for good experiences. But we have this bias for action to do something, which doesn't necessarily create those opportunities. And fundamentally, this is about team building, team intelligence, team brilliance, and I think we create insufficient opportunities of team building, and I think team building occurs very often despite rather than because of our setups. So it happens over night shifts or during a particularly traumatic and difficult case if the team is able to reflect on that and build from there. But we can see that that could easily go the other way too. So I think it is despite rather than because our system that we have team building within it. So just before I finish up, I just want to touch a little bit more about a couple of slides on the idea of social capital for people who are less familiar with this phrase. So we're very familiar with financial capital, and hopefully persuaded you that financial capital has its limits and that a very hungry health and social care system has unintended consequences for which we will all pay as a society and as a health and social care system if we're not careful. And social capital is much more about making social networks central, and this idea that transactions, between people who are invested in building social capital, that those are marked by reciprocity, trust, that word trust again, and cooperation. And that really it's not so much about the individual, but the broader mission, the team or the common good, and connecting people to that. And there's good evidence that actually when people feel connected to something that is reciprocal and helping somebody else and is wider than themselves, that they feel a greater sense of well-being, they feel more motivated, that their intrinsic motivation is greater. From my perspective, I think social capital, rather than a relatively dry definition that I showed you earlier, is about getting, not by I say big relationships, I put that in inverted commas, I mean the relationships between organizations. So I'm a clinical director for a small organization, a minnow in amongst, for example, huge trusts, but it's really important that we establish that adult-adult dialogue with our big partners and get the relationships right, but that we also get the small relationships right. And I don't mean small in a derogatory way, I mean small in the one-to-one, the person-to-person relationships. And this is key, that word trust again, this is about trust and also being trustworthy, because there's no point investing trust in systems or people who are not trustworthy. Most people are trustworthy, and it's about building on that trustworthiness, encouraging that, calling out when trustworthiness does not exist, and building on trust. And I think it's also about a spirit of generosity, that idea that the team is much greater than the sum of its parts, and you can extrapolate that from a very small team of physiotherapists right up to a large organization or a whole system, a whole country. And that idea of agreeing on common ground and broader aims, that unifying thing that helps promote the common good. And in relation to small relationships, I just wanted to flag up, we had an adverse incident learning event a few weeks ago, and the little things are the big things. So we had 8 presenters talking as part of the day about cases where something had gone wrong, on occasion catastrophically wrong, and what was learned from that, what was felt to be the thing that needed to happen to help prevent it happening again, and also really encouraging that offer to say, let us know how we can help you avoiding finding yourself in that position. So the presenters were all given a small token, just a paperweight. It's just a thank you, and I think the power of thank you is incredible. And it's also just highlighting that we need to be better at encouraging courage and trust, and building a system where trust and trustworthiness are much more common currency. So in summary, I hope I've persuaded you that sufficient knowledge and sufficient financial capital are not enough to meet the challenge that we all face in health and social care, no matter which borders we're within. And the idea that social capital, that we not only need to actively nurture and value it and seek it out, but that is absolutely key to building and sustaining relationships that will improve both care for individuals and also the staff experience, because the two need to go hand in hand. So I'd really like to thank again Roisin and the wider team for the opportunity to present, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any, and I apologise for the start about the muffling and the slightly speedy conversation. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Mark. I forgot to unmute myself again. It's myself and actually Dr. Philip Crowley has joined us here. So that was an excellent
I've been here all along.
Yeah, here all along. Tyler in the background. So we don't actually, we might just have 1 or 2 questions coming in there, but I think Philip, you might have a few.
Well, look, thank you so much for participating, Mark, and sharing those thoughts, which resonate a lot, I think, with a lot of probably the people listening in and watching, and with myself. We had a meeting where, between North-South interaction on Monday, and it was striking, I guess, how many similarities we have between our two systems, and I guess the issue that we confront. In terms of what you're talking about there, the importance of social capital, and what extent do you think that message is heard around where you're working in the north of Ireland? Do you feel that's a hard sell? I mean, are people still looking at the bottom line the whole time?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's not an immediate attention grabber, Philip. I think in some respects you can't necessarily count it and quantify it in a way that some sections of the system would be more comfortable with. But I think it's definitely rising. The idea of collaboration is rising in importance. I think if there's a plus side to the financial pressures that our system has been experiencing recently, is that people are much more willing to turn to their neighbour and start thinking about collaboration, more of a collective wealth approach to solving problems. I'm not going to pretend it's without its challenges, but I think it is tilting people's ideas more towards collaboration and collectivism. And I think there's very good practical examples. So yesterday evening I was at a QI event at the Southeastern Trust on the outskirts of Belfast, an organisation that Hugh Mackay heads, and they've invested significant resource in creating a space for that meeting. And it was actually a curry club yesterday evening, so they were eating together. So in many ways they're ahead of even the much vaulted IHI in terms of eating together, sharing a common purpose, and creating that space. And that space is about focusing on anybody interested in improvement coming and having the opportunity to come together and build that network and build those relationships. So I think the shoots are there. In some places the shoots are more developed, the green shoots are more developed than in other places, but I do think it's gaining traction. But I think the term social capital needs to be more widely understood, and not just by the health and social care system, but also by the public, because they can be part of that social capital too, and in many ways are.
I just had one question that really resonated with me on one of your slides there around the knowledge economy and about how it enables a move away from collectivism to individualism. And I don't know whether it's still a problem in the North, but you know, the traditional medical model and one person thinking will dictate the team thinking. And have you any tips or thoughts on that, or how we can move away from that? You know, do we need to start thinking about at undergraduate level more training as teams? Or any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're right. I think some specialties are naturally more geared towards team-based behaviour than others. So emergency departments, for example, spring to mind, different specialties. But I'm not going to start listing which in case for fear of offending people. I think it's possible for all of us, because it's so deeply ingrained, that the knowledge capital and the core belief system. I think it's important for us, just as a starting point, to have that awareness of what our cognitive bias is, and to not feel that our core belief is threatened if somebody comes along with an alternative suggestion. If you're not defined by how much you know on a given day, and I think if you do go in only with that view, or predominantly, overwhelmingly with that view, I think that is the route to madness. And I think even just as a starting point, having that awareness, you're not defined only by your knowledge. It's about your willingness to receive ideas or inputs from others.
Yeah, great. Just some comments actually from Maureen Flynn online about trust and trustworthiness and how central it is to team and social capital, and she's loving the concept and thinking about practical ways to support this. And one of the examples here, which we've rolled out as part of the Quality Improvement Division's work, is the sports rounds. I don't know whether you've any experience of those, Mark, in the North.
Aware of them, no practical experience of them, having tried to dip my toe in them, but I know there's a real sort of methodology to it. And it was great to hear on Monday from Maureen and Philip and others about that you're really pushing this more. And I know that one of our trusts, the Belfast Trust, are trying to propagate an initiative in that, and I think that should be encouraged for sure.
Great. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the concept of eating together is interesting. I mean, I think we asked ourselves, you know, how often we eat with the people who we want to have effective relations with. It's probably fairly seldom. I invariably eat at my desk, so I'm one of those merchants. So I like that idea. And I wonder, are there other simple things like that? I mean, there are obviously, you know, creating social interactions that are not, you know, with the people you want to have these relationships, but not necessarily, obviously, at work. You could go out together as well. You could play some kind of sport together, that kind of stuff. We used to do a lot more of that in hospital, certainly when I was in hospital medicine.
Even as well, one of the things that we've started to try to do is, you know, around person-centeredness and trying to mix up the way you have your meetings. So, you know, have a meeting outside, or go for a walk and have your meeting. You know, things like that. It just kind of creates a better team spirit, I think.
Different atmosphere, yeah. Rather than sitting around.
Yeah.
Your
Mark, how often do you meet at your desk? Say 5 days. Say 5 working days.
I actually now try and only do it about once a week. I genuinely actively try and seek out somebody that I can eat with. So, yeah, no, I'm just checking. Am I over-egging that? No, that's about right. I would say about 3 to 4 times a week, I try and eat with other people.
That's setting us a challenge.
There you go, yeah.
That's setting us a challenge.
If everyone takes that away, that one thing away, and tries to do something around that.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, unless there's no other burning questions, everyone's been quiet today. I think you were so clear. Maureen she says, she's had 2 walking meetings recently and definitely creates a different atmosphere in ICUT. There you go. So maybe people could try as well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Mark, just to say thank you so much for taking the time and for putting up with our earlier technical difficulties. But we managed to sort that out. So thanks for your patience and thanks so much for imparting all of your knowledge with us this afternoon, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to collaborate with yourselves in Northern Ireland. And just direct people to the slides, the next slide, Mark, on the knowledge and skills and the qualityimprovement.ie. So if you go on to qualityimprovement.ie, the QI Talk Time web page is there, and this webinar will be up there, both the slide set and the recording for people to access afterwards. We have one final webinar before we finish off for the summer, and that's with Professor Lloyd Provost from the States, not sure
Austin, Texas. Yeah.
Austin, Texas. So hopefully our technology will cross the borders. So that's on July 3rd, and the information will be circulated about that in the coming days. Lastly, we have put in a link in the chat box, which is a SurveyMonkey. It's to help us plan for our next season of webinars. Any ideas or thoughts or ways we can improve things, please do fill in the survey for us and give us some of your views. So thanks a million for that, and thank you again, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Cheers.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Can you see